All right, this video concerns last Friday's class, so April 1st. There's a technical issue, so I wasn't able to upload the recording. So this is going to be a replacement for that class. So I'm just going to kind of go over very quickly what we did in that class and highlight some of the key discussions, key elements of the subject matter. So the first thing we did is talk about work for the week. So there was nothing due for that week, so that was good. We did a few practice quiz questions. We'll continue to do those questions as we progress throughout the semester because those were helpful, or at least people said they were helpful to them. But then we got back into the socio-political form of the afterlife. And so it's important to remember in the socio-political form of the afterlife, the idea is that we are looking at the afterlife. We're trying to figure out its purpose or the desire that it corresponds to from the perspective of a particular socio-political situation. In particular, we are looking at the idea of people that are poor, or marginalized, or persecuted, or excluded, so on and so forth. So with that in mind, the first form of that socio-political afterlife, and there's going to be three forms of it. So what I'm calling a consolation afterlife, where the belief essentially consoles believers for the suffering that they endure. It makes that suffering more acceptable. It makes it more bearable. But that's ultimately going to be a problem for those that critique this form of the afterlife. So there's that form of the afterlife. Then we are going to move on to what I'm calling a vengeance-based form of the afterlife, where you see a real desire for payback, a real desire for vengeance from the perspective of those who are excluded, marginalized, persecuted. They want to take their turn in the role of persecutor or oppressor or dominant figure. And then the final form of the socio-political afterlife that we'll look at is a liberation theology, or a liberation afterlife, where the point is to eradicate the original conditions of persecution, sin, suffering, so on and so forth. Okay, so with that in mind, so to go back to the consolation form of the afterlife, and this is essentially where we finished the class, looking at Marx, Camus, and Engels. So on Wednesday, we looked at Marx, and we really focused on his opium quote, the notion that religion is like an opiate, religion is like a drug. And essentially the problem with religion in this sense is that I make myself feel better by use of that drug or by use of religion. And so it gives me some kind of temporary high. It gives me a feeling of pleasure, but it covers over that pain. And that's really kind of the issue. And at the end of the day, it doesn't solve the problem. So it makes you feel better, but it doesn't actually address the problem that is making you feel bad in the first place. And so it doesn't ultimately allow those that are believing in this kind of the afterlife to actually change their real conditions, to change what they're kind of enduring right now in this life, at this moment. And that for Marx and Camus and Engels is going to be a problem, because essentially what it does is that it ensures that those that are oppressed, that those that are at the bottom of the ladder are going to remain there. And so what we're going to do this week, or this day, this class, is look at a few more of those quotes to further understand how it is that religion keeps one at the bottom of the ladder. And so we're going to start with, or we started with that class, an excerpt from Camus. And actually two quotes. We're going to go actually Marx first and then Camus. So Marx writes, "The mortgage the peasant has on heavenly blessings guarantees the mortgage the bourgeoisie or those in power have on peasant lands." And Marx also reminds suffering Christians that, quote, "You have been told that your treasure is not of this world," end quote. So both of those quotes are important because they get to this notion that the afterlife puts the believer in the perspective of awaiting some reward for their suffering. In other words, yes, that they suffer now. Yes, that they are in pain now. Yes, that they endure persecution now. But the idea is that this is actually beneficial in the long run. This is actually useful in the long run, because it is a down payment on their heavenly mansion. So the idea is, look, you, the bourgeoisie, you that have the power, essentially you can take what you want now. You can abuse me. You can persecute me. You can have this world, because every time I am persecuted, I have a better chance, or I'm putting another payment on that heavenly that heavenly mortgage, that heavenly mansion. And so the more I suffer, the more I can believe that this mansion, this paradise, awaits me. And that mortgage quote is actually probably the second most famous quote from Marx on religion, the first being the opium quote. So again, he's saying that, look, suffering is actually useful and actually beneficial and actually good, Marx isn't saying that it's actually good, but he's saying this is what happens in the mind of the believer. The mind of the believer, views it as good, views it as worthwhile, because it's going to lead to, again, something blissful, something, infinitely rewarding. Camus then goes on, and he writes, and so Camus is a French philosopher, French existentialist philosopher in the 20th century, someone who was an atheist, but also had deep sympathy for religion. So he critiques it, but he's not, kind of a militant, anti-religious person. But he says, all right, there is an act of metaphysical rebellion at the beginning of Christianity, but the resurrection of Christ and the annunciation of the kingdom of heaven, interpreted as the promise of eternal life, are the answers that render it futile. So what he's saying here is that essentially, and this is going to be developed a little bit later in the quotes with a little further depth, both in terms of Marx and Camus, is essentially that religion begins with a protest. Religion begins by noticing that there's something wrong with this world. There's something wrong with reality. And that's the same thing for Marx with the opium quote. He says that religion is essentially a response to suffering. And we feel something's wrong, and so we start using, like a drug user might use a drug to feel better, to escape. So too does religion become an escape from an original position that is bad. And so the origin of religion is not the problem. The problem is what religion does to that origin, that it covers it over. And so for Camus, the idea is that Christianity, he's talking about Christianity in particular, begins with an act of metaphysical rebellion. In other words, the very nature of the existence is messed up in some way. Kind of like Tolstoy saying that the very nature of existence is wrong, is bad, because, it involves finitude and contingency. Life can, be destroyed at any moment. And we end in decay and death. And so Camus is also saying, look, there's a problem with the very structure of reality, but Christianity provides an answer. And in providing an answer, the problem is no longer a fundamental problem. It's a problem that is solved. So it's not a real problem. It's a problem that appears, that we encounter. But at the end of the day, it's only a problem in appearance, because there really is an answer. There really is a solution for this problem. Engels, this guy Engels was a close friend of Marx, and he writes, and he summarizes the nature of a flight, so a flight from kind of this world, and he acknowledges that both Christianity and the workers' socialism, so this is Engels, he wants to believe in workers' socialism or communism, the idea that human beings can recreate society in a way that is beneficial to all. And he says, all right, both Christianity and the workers' socialism preach forthcoming salvation from bondage and misery. Again, religion, the origin is okay. The origin is good. It is meant to address a problem, or at least that it rises in response to a problem. And both Christianity and workers' socialism do that. However, Christianity places salvation in a life beyond, after death, in heaven. Socialism places it in this world, in a transformation of society. And he goes on to describe this kind of Christian escape from this world, this Christian flight to heaven. And he says, in the position of those dominated by Romans, so he's talking about kind of early Christianity, where was the way out? Quote, where was the way out? Salvation for the enslaved, oppressed, and impoverished. A way out common to all these groups of people. This way out was found, but not in this world. In the state in which things were, it can only be a religious way out. So what Engels is saying there is, again, religion offers a solution to the problem, the original problem of oppression or suffering, but its solution transfers the believer to another world. The solution is otherworldly. The solution doesn't actually do anything in this world. And so again, there's this point that religion arises in response to a problem, and in that way it's legitimate, but the problem is the way it solves that problem. And in the solution, it becomes illegitimate. And what's interesting about this Engels quote is he's saying, in that situation, the only way out was that of otherworldly salvation, which indicates that for somebody like Engels, and certainly this would be shared by Marx, Christians are weak. They're impotent. They're not able to kind of solve their problems on their own. They have to appeal to some other kind of world, some other kind of God, because they're not able to do it themselves. And so what this shows is essentially that those who are religious believers, according to Engels and according to Marx, are weak. It's a weakness to believe in religion, because essentially you're saying, I can't solve my problems myself, or human beings can't solve our problems, so we've got to go somewhere else. We've got to give it up to God. All right, I'm going to go on here to a couple bottom quotes. All right, so this is going to go a little further into why religion doesn't work as a solution, and how actually the solution covers over the problem. So one of the big things that occurs here with religion is that it solves the problem of suffering. But in solving the problem of suffering, it gives it an explanation. But once something has an explanation, once there's a reason for it to exist, it no longer becomes as unbearable, because there's some point, there's some purpose. There's some reason that, my kid died, or that I got cancer, or that, I lost my job, or that my wife left me, something like that. There's some reason for this. And Marx writes, the social principles of Christianity preach the necessity of a ruling and oppressed class. And for the latter, they have only the pious wish that the former will be benevolent. The social principles of Christianity transfer the consistorial settlement of all infamies to heaven, and thereby justify the continuation of these infamies on earth. The social principles of Christianity declare all vile acts of oppressors against the oppressed to be either just punishment for original sin and other sins, or suffering that the Lord in his infinite wisdom has destined for those redeemed. Okay, so here we get from Marx a couple of explanations, a couple of ways that religion explains suffering and thereby annuls it, or thereby diminishes its sting, diminishes its unjustifiability, that there's no real reason for this kind of suffering. But again, once it's justified, once it's given an explanation, we can feel like it is justified. And once we feel like it is justified, we're less likely to address it. We're less likely to do something about it. And this is what certainly Marx wants to get away from, as well as Camus and Engels. And so what are these explanations? Well, the first one is that the social principles of Christianity preach the necessity of a ruling and oppressed class. In other words, Christianity embraces a hierarchy where there is a master and a slave, or where there is a ruler and a ruled. And that goes to the very nature of God, right? God is the ultimate ruler, and we are to be the ruled. God is the master, and we are God's subjects. So now, what Marx is saying is that by justifying this kind of this hierarchy, you thereby give a reason for oppression to exist. He says, the social principles of Christianity transfer the consistorial settlements of all infamies to heaven, and thereby justify the continuation of these infamies on earth. Kind of just like what I've been talking about throughout this video. The idea is that there's going to be an answer. There's going to be, something that occurs after this life that will make up for whatever suffering that you endure. The idea of waiting for this heavenly mansion. Marx in another quote says, and he cites this priest's sermon to a prostitute. And he says, the priest says to the prostitute, "Here below, my poor child, you will have tears, remorse, and penance, but one day up above, forgiveness and eternal bliss." He also goes on and he kind of critiques, he pushes back against those believers that are upset about something wrong going on in their world. And he says, but you've been told that your sufferings of this life are not going to be compared to the bliss of the future, that the suffering in patience and the bliss of hope are cardinal virtues. So in other words, again, just wait. Things might not be right here, but they will be right in heaven. And again, that sense that, yes, things will be rectified, things will be put right, gives me more of a reason to accept and to endure this suffering and this injustice in the moment. He says the social principles of Christianity declare all vile acts of the oppressors against the oppressed to be their just punishment for original sin and other sins. So there, you get an explanation for suffering based upon sin. It is a punishment, right? So don't complain about it. You've done this to yourself, or we as human beings have done this to ourselves. When we suffer, when we're oppressed, it is a punishment for what we've done. So that's another way that you can explain and thereby justify suffering. And then finally, he writes, about suffering being justified by the Lord in his infinite wisdom. And so there, the idea is, well, we might not be able to figure out exactly what the solution is. We might not know why suffering exists and how it's going to be rectified. But don't worry, there is a answer, and that answer is held by God. So it's still, again, this appeal to an explanation and justification, but it's at that point saying, well, we don't know exactly what it is, but we believe that there is an explanation, that there is a justification, and that's ultimately held by God. And the last thing I want to say, kind of going back to a quote that I read from Marx, suffering and patience and the bliss of hope are cardinal virtues. So another way in which religion anesthetizes believers, in other words, kind of keeps them in their place, keeps them believing that this suffering is in some way okay, that it's acceptable to endure it, not to get rid of it. Another way that religion does that is to preach, according to Marx and Camus and Engels, virtues and behaviors and characteristics that ensure the oppressed person is going to remain oppressed. It ensures that the oppressed person is going to be humble and obedient and, patient. All those kind of behaviors and virtues that allow one to remain oppressed. Because if I am patient and humble and obedient, I'm more likely to, just shut up and take it, essentially. So to kind of the big picture here, Marx, Camus, and Engels, they all believe that religion is a negative force in human life, insofar as it keeps people in their place of oppression or subservience, and it doesn't solve the actual problem. It doesn't solve the real kind of inequities or injustices. So how does it do that? Well, religion provides it provides relief, it provides happiness, but ultimately that's an illusory, temporary kind of happiness because it doesn't address the core problem, right? In that way, it's very much like a drug, as Marx said. It makes you feel better in the moment, but it doesn't actually solve the problem that gave rise to the use in the first place. So that's one big way that it keeps people oppressed, keeps people patient, keeps people accepting their suffering. The second explanation, or the second reason that it keeps people oppressed, is the idea that religion provides an explanation for that suffering. So just what I've been talking about, gives it a justification, gives it a reason to exist. Because if something had no reason to exist, it was absolutely unnecessary, then we would work, according to Marx, Camus, and Engels, to get rid of it, to abolish it. And then finally, it encourages the believer to adopt behaviors and characteristics that are characteristic of people that are oppressed, that are enslaved, that are dominated by others. Patience, humility, obedience. Those kind of characteristics are promoted by religion, and so therefore they promote oppression by promoting subservience, by promoting kind of shut up and take it. Okay, so that's it for this video, and that is essentially a recap of our class on Friday.